Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you this week, there's a bunch of news that will set off anti-vaxxers, whether it is a vaccine that will lower cholesterol by a significant 30%, or the RSV vaccine that could lower admissions to hospital by infants by 80%. We also have a somewhat novel weight loss development involving a pill that vibrates. Not necessarily the kind of vibration you might expect. Didier Raoult's research institute has come under fire by a wide range of other researchers for their complacency in allowing him to effectively detract from and harm the reputation of all science. A late blight continues to cause extensive damage in Punjab, India. A firm has developed a means of turning your poop into jet fuel, although the degree of productivity is questionable, and Japan is about to land its lunar lander. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with vaccines and really trigger those anti-vaxxers who somehow believe vaccines are the bane of all existence. They've clearly not encountered any significant diseases to believe that. The first of these triggers is a vaccine that is currently in development that could lower low-density lipoproteins, or what would generally be a form of cholesterol, although cholesterol is a broad category itself and only one of the low-density lipoproteins, by up to 30%. This is a significant achievement, as lowering cholesterol using a vaccine rather than the general choice to use medication could have a concerted effect where one would be made more effective by the other. Given that somewhere around 40% of the US population, accurately the adult US population, has high cholesterol levels, this would be a massive benefit. Further to that, it would also mitigate some of the effect of poor diet, which in the USA is another major factor. The way this works is that they take a virus and they effectively strip out all the genetic material from within it, leaving only the viral shell. This viral shell is more than capable of activating the immune system and is arguably what the immune system would largely target under normal circumstances. By having just this shell, it prevents the virus from becoming an effective agent. It simply cannot recreate itself. All it can do is dock itself to the appropriate receptors and stay there. It's kind of like junk mail. It gets into your mailbox, but it doesn't actually go anywhere or ever get used. Because of this, though, it gets picked up by the immune system, the same way junk mail gets picked up by scanning software. And then it gets disposed of. Except in the case of the immune system, there's a memory of this particular viral shell. And that's the key here. It leaves behind just enough information that the immune system is able to start picking up on LDL more effectively. What the immune system is doing isn't necessarily targeting the LDL itself or cholesterol. Rather, it's triggering a mechanism to, suppress LDL production, the normal bodily production, something medication would normally do. And in this case, it's targeting a specific molecule that would normally interact with the receptors and prevent the receptors from recognizing that cholesterol's too high. In doing this, it has effectively blocked junk mail from getting into the body or your email address. And next we have the RSV vaccine. RSV being the respiratory syncytial virus. It's a relatively common childhood virus, and it causes, rather obviously, issues with the respiratory system given its name. Because of the effect it has, it can often lead to individuals being hospitalized, or more accurately, infants and children being hospitalized. And this is both somewhat traumatic to the children, but also, at least in the case of America, are likely to cost you several limbs and organs to pay for the bill. In the rest of the world, it's just generally trauma and unpleasant. Clinical trials into the effectiveness of this has shown that giving the vaccine to children in particular reduces admissions by more than 80%. Yeah. That's a massive benefit, and arguably, given that the vast majority of cases occur before the age of 2, you're going to see huge benefits given the relatively small availability of pediatric and neonatal units for those who would be infected. As of now, the vaccine's only available in 3 locations, the first being the United States of America and Spain, the second. However, in the UK, while technically available, it's not available under the NHS, which means individuals would have to pay for it privately, which for Americans is probably a really bizarre concept. You have to pay for everything privately in the USA. Next, we have research that sounds promising, but you must take it with a lot of skepticism. And not just because of what it is, but how it's been developed and, let's say, proofed. It's a means of destroying cancer cells using infrared light and vibrations. The infrared light basically excites the molecules and causes them to vibrate and fall apart. This is not actually that different to what you would expect elsewhere. It is, to a certain extent, what happens with a lot of light that you're exposed to on a day-to-day basis. Some of the warmth you feel from sunlight is actually the infrared light. The infrared light is also one of the reasons why you tend to develop skin cancer. It can penetrate much further into the body and, as a result, begin to screw the cells, leading to melanomas amongst other kinds of skin cancer. What's important here is that because of that extra depth of reach, the unit that does this, something called a Feringa motor, is able to work at much greater depth, and they can effectively target it. Older versions of this relied on visible light, and unfortunately visible light both has very poor specificity, as in you can't target it very well, but also it doesn't penetrate very deep. And now for why we say this has to be taken extremely skeptically. All of this was proofed in the lab-grown cell cultures of cancer. Unfortunately, in 99% of instances where you have a test tube with something, you can kill it with anything and everything. You don't really need to have any intent. As such, it's basically impossible to say test tube results mean anything. The rodent model testing is significantly more promising, although they were focusing on melanoma tumors rather than your standard cancers, which, depending on what you're talking about, is arguably something like lung cancer, bowel cancer, and so on. Despite this, they did have a 50% success rate in completely clearing away the cancer from the rodents they tested this on. In similar kinds of quasi-clinical news, we have what is described as a pill that could lead to significant weight loss through reducing food intake. This is effectively a replacement for self-control and increased exercise, although arguably this is not true in all cases. There are some instances where, due to a variety of inherited, congenital, or otherwise unavoidable illnesses, it doesn't work out so well. But nonetheless, the idea here is MIT engineers have taken a pill and they've allowed it to vibrate, and when it vibrates, it activates receptors within the stomach, telling the stomach that it's completely full. This will reduce the impulses sent to the brain, telling you should probably eat something. The idea behind it would be to take one of these before eating, and then while you continue to eat, your stomach is activated earlier to tell you that you're full, thereby reducing the volume of the meal or number of meals you would eat. The device itself is supposed to be significantly more affordable than most of the other interventions that achieve similar results, such as gastric banding or similar. What it does is take a small 30mm or just over a 1-inch long capsule. Inside of this capsule, you'll find a spring-loaded mechanism that will switch on a vibrating motor once the capsule is within the stomach. Once this motor starts going, it will buzz, and this buzzing will be at just the right frequency to stimulate the nerves in the stomach that tell you you are full, or at least that the stomach is getting towards being full. The way it's designed means that it lasts for roughly 20 to 30 minutes, meaning that there is plenty of time to take the pill and then eat a meal and still probably have plenty of activity left in said capsule. The only obvious downside to this is that the device does utilize a battery. Thankfully, none of the more complicated or dangerous batteries, such as lithium or something like nickel-cadmium. Instead, it uses a silver oxide battery. The challenge now will be figuring out how to mass-produce the device and, theoretically, arguably, make it safer in terms of the issues around what happens once you pass said battery after you've completed your meal. Or, be more accurate to say, the food cycle. Next we have a somewhat more questionable study trying to argue that vegan diets are much better than omnivore diets. The basic premise is not actually bad. The basic premise is take 22 pairs of twins, so 44 adults. Divide the adults into 2 groups, with 1 twin in each group, and give one the omnivore diet and give one the vegan diet and see what happens. That by itself is actually a perfect design. It is a twin study and you can't get much better. However, and this is the big however, they only ran the controlled portion of this for 4 weeks. The second 4 weeks of their 8-week trial expected the individuals involved to look after themselves, which brings in a lot of confounding variables. And now for the problems. First of all, there's that 4-week window in the second half where they've just decided to let the individuals go for themselves after being given meals for 4 weeks. The other is that the vegan diet was calorie deficient from the get-go. Yeah, so you already have a massive issue with the comparative groups. The third and final issue with that is that, well, you give these individuals a planned and prepared diet for 4 weeks, and then you give them their own free rein for 4 weeks, but you only measure the result at the very first week, or more accurately before the study starts, and at the end of 8 weeks. You've not actually put that 4-week test in that you need to have. Without looking at the data at the end of the 4th week, you don't know if weeks 5 to 8 actually had the individuals showing any benefit from applying the diet themselves. And this does lead us to the final issue with this study, the error bars. Oh god, these error bars are really bad amongst the vegan group, which tells you that amongst the vegans at least, there is a great deal more variability, and theoretically that variability is going to be down to, well, a lack of control. Exactly the issue that you're meant to avoid with a clinical trial of this design. To be clear, this is not the worst possible research you could do. At the moment, that award probably goes to Didier Raoult and his bullshit studies on things like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and purported benefits for COVID-19, which is nonsense, but it is what it is. This has led to a increasing number of individuals calling for not only the research that's been coming out of the institute that he worked at, but his work as well to be withdrawn. And it all comes down to the fact that most of his research is really bad research. By itself, there's been a bunch of issues around things like legal issues, ethical issues, methodological issues, and a range of other problems that aren't worth mentioning in great detail. The impetus for this and other calls for action have been the preprint article that they were trying to publish, which involved the prescription of hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19 without any evidence to support its use. Yeah, it was effectively a Wild West approach to scientific research, something we've not allowed to be doing since Mengele and Tuskegee. This, let's call it study, led to the involvement of not just criminal investigators, but also issues around the, university itself, the ethical board that approved these things, and a bunch of other problems which effectively have completely shut down Didier Raoult to ever do research again at this stage, and may possibly earn him a very small box to live in for the remainder of his life. And next we have a somewhat more kind of useless result, but it's claims to find the driving force behind dark impulses, although finding the internet isn't hard, but apparently that's not what these researchers believe is behind things like psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellism. The German and Danish researchers have apparently begun mapping these various traits and how they drive the darkest desires and impulses. They've named this the dark factor of personality, also commonly called meet D for dark. The reason they've been trying to map it the way they are is that it's been found that if you perform well in one intelligence test, you're likely to perform well in other intelligence tests, and this was something discovered over 100 years ago, so that's not a novel discovery. The theory was that if you have a general intelligence factor, you might also have a general dark impulse factor, or let's say a psychopathy factor. Something that perhaps Hannibal Lecter could tell us more about. The next news is environmental, and it does build on recent news coming out of Africa. The development here is India-based though, and specifically in Punjab, where there's been a more than 50% loss in potato yield due to late blight. A late blight effectively being the same sort of thing that affected the Irish population during the potato famine. This, of course, is something that could be solved, and arguably has been solved in places like Africa, where genetically modified potatoes have shown distinct and clear benefits in mitigating all of the issues, simply by transferring one wild-type potato gene into the other, more conventionally grown potato varieties. The issue with what's happened is twofold. One is that, well, the actual food potatoes aren't available for people to buy. The second issue is that in order to grow more potatoes, you need to already have potatoes. Those seed potatoes aren't as readily available, meaning that there's a huge demand at a wholesale level for seed potato to be able to grow next year's crop, while also competing with the general market for people to be able to buy potatoes as a food. Shifting to news that will at least make you feel better if it's not more confused. North American otters appear to be thriving due to nuclear weapons testing. Yeah, this is not going to lead to a Godzilla-like otter, but it is at least somewhat understandable. The radiation is coming from a leak, and it's due to underground testing of nuclear weapons decades earlier. The testing was done on a particular island. Said island had a large number of otters on it, and due to pressure from environmental conservation and even state level, like the government of Alaska, otters were relocated. Unfortunately, the remaining otters, apparently close to 900 of them, were not relocated, and, well, you can probably guess what happens when you experience a nuclear blast, let alone the 3 that went off on this island. This is where the nuclear testing is related to the otters. Because the otters were relocated from the testing island over a fairly long period, they were able to be relocated to other areas where there were relatively a few otters, generally about 50 at a time due to limitations of the craft they were using. When this happened, they basically gave the otters in other regions a huge bump in their population, and this allowed them to be effectively temporarily increased, but that increase led to a huge boom after the fact. After all, if you suddenly increase the population, or put them in a new environment that is hospitable to them, or at least more so than a fallout location, you'll find that they tend to breed voraciously. Next we have a plan to use faeces to develop jet fuel. This is a bizarre plan, but it does make some sort of sense, in a very twisted way. The company is developing jet fuel made entirely from sewage, and in theory, this wouldn't be a bad thing. After all, it would convert what is, quite literally, a waste product into kerosene, which can then be used to run aircraft, which ultimately doesn't add as much to climate change due to greenhouse gases, as much being key here. Analysis of the product that was made has found that it's nearly identical to the standard kind of fuels that are used for aircraft, so it's going to significantly be the same without as much, and as much is key here, of the carbon footprint. The researchers argue that it's somewhere about 90% more carbon efficient, so you have a much smaller footprint, only 10% of what you would normally get. The issues with this are kinda straightforward. They calculate that each person could make 4 to 5 litres of this jet fuel each year. This, of course, appears to assume things like 100% of waste finds their way to their facilities, that the waste is 100% convertible based on their current statistics, and a bunch of other complications. In order to get a passenger jet to go a relatively short distance, or more accurately, to be able to get it to fly a single route, you would need about the waste product of 10,000 people. Understand, that's for one trip. And that's not exactly viable in the long term. You might be able to supply fuel for the first month of flying in a year, and then from thereafter every vehicle would be grounded since there's no fuel available. At least the people involved do recognize this, and their case to be made is that they're not looking to replace all of the aviation fuel. Rather, they could submit a portion of it or substitute a portion of it for this biofuel. That portion is renewable, and that would help companies meet their sustainable aviation fuel requirements, although that requirement itself is rather mild at just 10%. In other energy-related news, we have China's plan to build a thorium-powered shipping container ship. Why they want to use thorium is unexpected and stupid. It's basically, thorium is the most novel idea most people come up with ages, even though honestly it's not much better than most other material that could be used for a fission reactor. The other issue with this container ship is somewhat more practical. It may only be able to run a certain number of routes, and that's because of size considerations. The facilities available to receive ships of a certain size, or more accurately, over a certain size, is limited by its capacity to fit them. And because of this, it may not be able to pass through certain facilities, for example, the Suez Canal. There's also the other issue which has been encountered in the past regarding nuclear-powered vessels. They may not be able to enter certain ports. In fact, they have previously built nuclear-powered ships like this. They were trying to run them as cruise liners and then as container ships, and found that some ports simply would not let them enter because they were nuclear-powered. Military ships get around this issue by, using naval ports, facilities specifically dedicated to them, whereas these others aren't actually going to be so easily facilitated, even though they have a roughly 20-year lifetime with a roughly 10-year refueling period. The only vessel of this kind that is still in use is the Soviet-era Semovput, which is an icebreaker used by Russia, and that was built in 1986. At the moment, it's received an in-principle approval from most national bodies, but for now we don't even know how well it will work as it's still under production. But it should be finished relatively soon, and we'll see how practical this design is, and whether or not it even works going to other countries' ports. Speaking of other places, the final news item we have for you this week is all about Japan's probe entering lunar orbit and just about to make its landing. This will make it one of the few countries that has successfully landed on the moon's surface. The key here being successfully. A number of countries have tried to land on the moon and failed rather spectacularly. If successful, this would make Japan the 5th. The only other countries to succeed have been the United States, Russia, China, and India. Getting to the moon so far has taken about 3 months, so it's a rather long wait between the launch of this lander and its actual landing, which is somewhat of a letdown, but arguably good things come slowly. Somewhat anyway. What makes this, let's say, research somewhat more special, rather than just being a lunar lander, is it's an incredibly precise lander. Most attempts so far have basically been happy if they can get within 10 kilometers of where they wanted to be. They're expecting to land within 100 meters of where they want to be. The reason they expect to be able to make such a precise landing owes to the nature of the probe that they're dropping. It's very small, about the size of a tennis ball, and because of its structure and the fact that it's basically derived from a toy, it can change its shape to move across the lunar surface. With this being the third, and arguably third time is the charm, attempt by Japan to land on the moon, we should know within a few weeks as to how successful or unsuccessful they've been. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.